Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Welcome back, everybody. After a much-deserved lunch break, we're ready to start with panel 4, called Migration in a Transdisciplinary Perspective. My name is Charlotte Sonne. I'm a medical doctor, soon psychiatrist to be, from the Competence Center for Transcultural Psychiatry here in Copenhagen. I will do what Peter did yesterday and try to keep my introductions quite brief, leaving more time for you to speak and tell about your studies. So first speaker here this afternoon is Charisse Singh, who has a PhD in social epidemiology and public health intervention research from the Karolinska Institute. Her research mainly focuses on the concepts related to social capital and neighborhood ethnic segregation. And the rest of your presentation I'll leave to you. Welcome, Charisse.
Thank you, Charlotte. Hello, everyone. Today I'll be presenting 2 studies in the field of social epidemiology focused on social participation and the mental health of refugees and asylum seekers in Sweden. And these studies are the result of a collaboration between 2 research groups at the Red Cross University and at the Karolinska Institute, both in Stockholm. And a little background on the topic of refugee mental health, just to give some context. There's an extensive body of research that shows that refugees experience poorer mental health than other migrant groups, due to a variety of pre- and post-migration factors, ranging from torture and violence in their home country and during flight, to resettlement challenges in host countries related to language difficulties, perceived discrimination, employment restrictions, insecure status, and social isolation. So research has also found that the loss of social networks is something that naturally happens when you move from one country to another, and that this reduces opportunities for social participation and has been linked to negative psychosocial health outcomes. So the role of social participation is frequently investigated in terms of labor market participation, but not so much in terms of the loss of social networks. And in social participation in research has been operationalized in numerous ways, but there's no unified or comprehensive model that's particular to the unique circumstances of refugees and asylum seekers. And so because it's such a broad concept, involving multiple way interactions and a variety of stakeholders, it can be perceived as more of a framework for participation. Including both a structure that provides the access and opportunity for participation in various social domains, as well as ascribing agency to refugees to actively participate in these social domains. So, in viewing social participation within the idea of a framework, my colleagues at the Red Cross University conducted a scoping review to systematically identify the ways in which social participation has been empirically described and operationalized in order to develop a more comprehensive conceptual model for social participation of refugees and asylum seekers. And then in the second paper, we used part of that model to better understand how social participation in informal networks in the host country is associated with depressive symptoms in a cohort of Syrian refugees. So I gave a little background already, so I'm going to skip these. So my colleagues conducted a scoping review across various academic disciplines to identify various forms of social participation as they were measured in research. And this was based on relevant inclusion and exclusion criteria. And the search returned 146 articles overall. And then after excluding for duplicates and according to the inclusion and exclusion criteria, we were left with 64 studies that were included in the final analysis. So from these studies, the authors found that social participation of refugees and asylum seekers could be characterized as taking place in 3 dimensions. So defined by first, regulations and frameworks, conditions and initiatives offered by the host government. Second, the dimension of established societal organizations. And the third, the dimension of community organized groups or informal networks. And here we have a visual representation of the conceptual model with the 3 dimensions, and each dimension has several domains. The model proposes a dynamic interaction between the 3 dimensions rather than an exhaustive and exclusive checklist for social frameworks for refugee and asylum seeker participation. So as you can see, dimension 1 is in the gray circle and represents regulatory frameworks, conditions, and initiatives. And it's described as the foundation of and determining conditions of the other 2 dimensions. So that's why it encompasses the other 2. Because we know that the opportunities, barriers, and facilitators for participation in key social spheres are dependent to a great extent on the legal status and the laws that regulate refugee access to host country social structures. So then dimension 2 is the established organizations and societal structures such as the labor market, financial transactions, education, and healthcare. And this dimension was defined by identifying explicit public reformer roles that need to be adopted in order to participate in these structures of society. So for example, as to participate in the educational structure, you become a student, or to participate in the healthcare system, you become a patient. Moving on to dimension 3, so this includes community organized group or more informal networks in which the participant enters in a more informal role. And the refugees themselves define these roles sorry, I got a little lost. So this dimension includes participation in NGOs, such as voluntary organizations and associations, sports, cultural or religious activities. And so in the second paper that I'm presenting, we used this 3rd dimension from the model to investigate the association between participation in informal and community-based networks and the prevalence of depressive symptoms among Syrian refugees in Sweden. So to give a little background of the Swedish context, Sweden is a country of over 10 million people with 20% immigrants and an additional 6% that are the children of 2 foreign-born parents. And in 2019, Syrians surpassed Finns as the largest foreign-born population in the country, with nearly 200,000 Syrian-born residents, and 64% of those residents have immigrated over the last 10 years. So a number of Swedish-based studies have found that there are mental health differences between immigrant groups, and that refugees and immigrants from non-Western countries in particular have higher prevalence of mental ill health than individuals with a Swedish background. And in terms of social network, you may have seen recently in the news, I don't know if it was news here, but in Sweden, the government released results from a survey that found that 13% of foreign-born individuals in Sweden do not have a close friend. And this is as opposed to 6% of individuals born in Sweden, and whether those individuals had Swedish parents or foreign-born parents. So we see that there's clearly a gap in social networks among foreign-born individuals in Sweden. So the impact of social participation in explaining health inequalities has been understudied in Sweden. The theory suggests that it can be more important to have access to co-ethnic, or what we would call bonding social networks, which would be a network of individuals from your same country, that it might be more important to have those networks in the beginning of the resettlement phase. And then the longer you're in a country, then the more important it is to diversify those networks. And the bonding networks would provide a sense of familiarity, belonging, and stability in a period of transition to a new place, whereas the cross-ethnic, or we call bridging networks, would offer opportunities for social mobility and a sense of belonging to wider society, which is important for longer-term health outcomes. So with this in mind, social support is an important emotional and instrumental resource that social participation conveys to the participants in social networks. So in this paper, we aim to understand the association between social participation and depression, as well as whether participating in bonding networks or bridging networks might convey or beget more social support. So this comes from the Red Cross University's study on resilience, mental health, and social participation among refugees. And this included individuals who responded to a questionnaire assessing pre- and post-migration attitudes, experiences, and mental health. The questionnaire was sent to a random sample of 4,000 newly arrived Syrian refugees, and the final sample size for the study was 464. This is a cross-sectional study, so it's good to bear in mind when considering the implications. And we used multi-group structural equation modeling for the analysis. So here we have social participation, which was modeled as the exposure. And to study social participation, we used from this third dimension, the different types of activities that a refugee might participate in. So arts and culture, sports and games, voluntary work, political organizations or debate, and entertainment and leisure activities. And so we asked them with what frequency they participated in these activities, and then we used a cluster analysis to create a social participation profile for each individual that would give us kind of an idea of the overall social participation. So this resulted in a variable that describes overall participation in terms of frequency in a broad range of activities or in a more limited range of activities. And so we have those two categories here, and then as a reference, we used rare or no participation in social activities. And then we included social support as a latent construct. And the outcome was depressive symptoms, which measured 15 items, looking at the degree to which respondents experienced depression-related symptoms over the last week. And then we set a model looking at 5 structural paths between social participation and depressive symptoms, social participation and social support, and social support to depressive symptoms. And then we looked at the relationship here between these 3 variables and whether it differed whether it differed for those who participated mainly in bonding networks versus those who participated mainly in bridging networks. So essentially this is looking at whether there's a relationship between social participation and fewer depressive symptoms, and if social support explains some of that relationship, and if participating in bonding versus bridging networks is more important for that relationship. So the results found that participating in both bonding and bridging networks was associated with fewer depressive symptoms. So we found whether it was a network of other Syrians or a network of mainly Swedes, that it had a beneficial effect for mental health. But what we did find also was that those who participated in bonding networks had an even greater protective effect against depressive symptoms. So, and because we included social support in the model, we could see that it's because those in bonding networks are more likely to get social support than those in bridging networks. So in conclusion, while the more diverse social ties of bridging networks can help prevent mental health, as we saw, the strong social ties that characterize bonding or co-ethnic networks appear to offer greater protection, at least to newly arrived refugees. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this interesting presentation and also for keeping time. Very much appreciated from my chair. So our next presenters, they'll be online from Belgium. Welcome. We have Sofie de Smet and Lise Missotten. And I apologize if I don't pronounce your names correctly. Sofie is a postdoctoral researcher affiliated to the research group Parenting and Special Education Research Unit at the University of Leuven and SPAM. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on the development and analysis of community-based interventions in host and post-conflict societies in transcultural mental health care. And Lise Missotten holds a PhD in psychology with a dissertation on developmental trends on adolescent conflict management with mothers. She is the project coordinator of a transcultural psychiatric daycare unit for minor refugees. Welcome, both of you. I'll try, I don't know if you can see me, but I'll try to sit down here and let you know when you have 3 minutes left by a 3-minute sign and 1 minute left by a 1 minute sign. The floor is yours.
Okay.
Can everybody hear us? Yes. Yeah? Okay. Great. So thank you very much for inviting us for this conference and also for having the opportunity to be online. Unfortunately, we couldn't be there live, but we're very happy to share a bit of our research and our intervention work that we are developing at the university in Belgium, in Leuven, in a small city in Belgium. And today we will introduce to you one intervention that we have been developing the last 2 years, a creative community-based support group for migrants and refugees in Belgium. And we are part of a bigger team of clinicians, therapists, cultural brokers, and researchers, the Transcultural Trauma Care team at Leuven. And together we develop different kind of mental health intervention for refugees and migrants. On the one hand, community-based intervention for the majority of the refugee population in Belgium. And this is also the focus of our presentation today. But following a more pyramidal structure of mental health intervention, we also develop transcultural trauma therapy as a specialized trauma-focused mental health care for the smaller minority of the population, and also transcultural psychiatric day treatment. And this is a bit of a figure of our work, so representing this pyramid of mental health intervention, having a focus on community-based, on offering support and offering social support for refugees, and focusing a lot actually on what Charisse told us in her presentation of how we can support recently resettled refugees, but also later on in the resettlement process to have access to social networks and to provide safety within these very important primary resources of support within the family, but also within the broader community.
Yeah, hello everybody. Before I start, I would like to say my voice is not what it's supposed to be because I have a throat infection. So I hope you can hear me well. So a few words about the goals of community-based mental health care interventions. They are focused around 3 dimensions. First one is that these community-based interventions really want to foster primary resources of support, as Sofie said, tapping into family relationships, peer relationships, but also community relationships. And by bringing people together, in our case, in a support program, we really want to reconnect them and embed them in social and cultural fabric. By doing so, we hope to restore, or these programs aim to restore, a sense of safety in these primary sources of support. And of course, at the lower layer of this pyramid, we also are able to identify people who are in need of more specialized trauma care, and we can also refer them to those services as well.
Okay, and today we focus also a little bit on the creative part, or why creative, community-based intervention. In that way, and we aim to integrate in different ways non-verbal ways of expression, of communication, as also a body of research has documented how it can foster self-expression and therefore also emotional self-regulation in verbalizing or talking about more difficult experiences as human rights violations. On an individual level, it can also install vehicles of change while using symbolic distancing, but also working in group. It can also offer safety through these vehicles of distancing for other participants who are listening, but also for therapists. And at the same time, art also can offer an opportunity to really integrate cultural symbols and very important cultural narratives, and to have access to them and for support.
Okay, and now a few words about the genesis or the development of our support program. So it was developed 2 years ago, right after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The president of our university asked our team to develop some kind of mental health support and psychosocial care for Ukrainian students and staff members at our university. So together with our clinical team, but also in close collaboration with some key figures of the Ukrainian diaspora in Leuven, we developed this support program for Ukrainian students and Ukrainian staff. And later on, we were allowed to expand this support program to other diaspora communities as well. So we ran groups for Iranian community at our university, also the Russian community. Now, recently, we did a mixed group, so for people from diverse national backgrounds, and also a Palestinian group now as we speak. And in the second part of this year, we also want to run Israeli and Jewish support group. So our program consists of 7 sessions, of 2-hour sessions every 2 weeks. Each session is centered around a specific theme. So the first session is welcoming the participants, getting to know each other a little bit, and co-constructing a set of ground rules that are necessary to work together in a safe way. The second session focuses on cultural belonging and identity, and I will explain to you in a bit a little bit more about this session. The third and the fourth sessions are psychoeducation sessions, where we work with the participants around the impact of collective violence and forced displacement. In session 5 and 6, we explore potential coping strategies. And in the final session, the closing sessions, we look back with the participants at the entire process and try to identify supportive mechanisms, both referring to the content of the program, but also to the group dynamics.
And after each session, we ask the group to administer a feedback questionnaire to get a bit of feedback also on a regular base, which is written and also offers participants to exchange with us also more individual things which are more difficult to maybe express within the group. For example, a question is, what surprised you or touched you the most during this session? And here is an answer of one of the Russian participants who said, the similarities of our stories, it felt as we participants really shared the same country, culture, sense of humor. It was quite heartwarming and partially surprising, because in the absence of frequent interaction with Russians, I forgot about this way to connect.
Sorry, my microphone was turned off. So unfortunately, we cannot explain all our sessions in detail, but we chose to tell you a little bit more about the second session, focusing on cultural belonging and cultural identity. For this session, we invite the participants to bring along an object, a home country object that is important to them and that tells something about where they come from or about their roots. And in the session, people share the story of this object to each other. And for us, the mechanisms or the important mechanisms in this session are really to provide a sense of containment of experiences of loss and ambivalence, but also to support adequate coping, because people, you can feel it happening in the session, can really also connect to certain cultural traditions or experiences. And on the next slide, you can see a picture of the objects of the Ukrainian student group, the objects they brought to the session, a drawing of a family member, a little bear from childhood, a specific bracelet with the Ukrainian national symbol. Voilà. So, and to learn more about this program and how it works and what are supportive processes, and also to strengthen it, we decided to also include research components to the program, consisting of two parts, a qualitative part and a quantitative part. And today we will tell you a little bit more about the findings from the interviews that we conducted. So in the middle of the program and at the end of the program, we invited participants for an interview to reflect upon supportive mechanisms during the program. And for today, Sofie will tell you a little bit more about the preliminary findings of the Iranian support group. So for this group, we had 9 participants joining the group, 3 male and 6 female participants, all students or postdocs or staff members of KU Leuven, and they were between 22 and 35 years old.
Okay, and one of the major impressions that participants also expressed how they perceived the program during the interviews is that they shared the idea that the support group offered a certain kind of space, limited in time and in space, to offer the opportunity to express themselves, to express certain difficult memories, but also conflictuous ideas or difficult interactions with family members, which were very very difficult to express actually in daily life. And this was a process that was described as a two-way highway, in a sense that participants were listening to each other and sharing, and as one could share something, it strengthened or it fostered the idea of others to also express certain ideas or more difficult and deeper emotions. And this emotional expression stood actually in quite a big contrast to the daily life interactions. First of all, many of them expressed the fear or the avoidance, or the idea to avoid these emotional expression in daily life because it could destabilize them while studying or while working, which was really important in resettlement. But at the same time, they also expressed a way to protect, the wish to protect family members from harm or from their suffering, because they were still in unsafety living in their home country. And at the same time, also in relationship to other community members, it was really difficult to engage in more deeper conversations about difficult processes, because there was a lot of relational distrust among the diaspora community members, not knowing who was pro or who was against the regime or which positions did they took took in the protests that were going on at that very moment, but also in relationship to host society members, Belgians. It was difficult to engage, as many was not aware about the position about the conflict in Iran, about the violence in Iran, and also experiences of racism in host society relationships. Indeed, for example, avoidance in family relationship to protect them, as one the participants said, so I feel guilty to express, I don't talk to my family members or my friends in Iran, but also because they experienced a lot of relational loss while leaving their country, having lost many important relationships, that engaging in emotional self-expression also requires a certain engagement, and many of them expressed the wish to do not so. At the same time, they also stress the importance of the therapist in this safe space, because it could offer a sense of neutrality and understanding, but also monitor certain tension that was at stake within the group, and to also verbalize these tensions, and to make boundaries to remembering processes which could be tried re-traumatizing. And in this space of self-expression, participants mentioned that in a sense it fostered a sense of self-understanding of who they are and why they feel what they feel. So it could normalize certain mental health issues, but also experiences of being a migrant in Belgium and feeling less isolated by sharing this with others. At the same time, it could also offer the opportunity to reconnect to certain memories which were avoided, childhood memories, because of the emotional suffering that was connected to it. And this is a picture of one of the sessions where we work around the globe, also as a symbol of how it affects so many people around the globe, the migration process, and of not being all alone in the world with these experiences. At the same time, it also seemed to foster a relational understanding, so a relationship to others. We saw that participants reconnected with family members, tried to engage more while mentioning mental health processes, and in that way also trying to go beyond the mental health stigma that was at stake within their relationships, but also in relationship to other Iranians, try to reconnect in a sense as they expressed that they were now able to contain this kind of tension or ambivalence, and they were more able to listen within the discussion. But also in relationship to host society, it seems that they could reconnect or to connect more to the host society or understand more their positioning within this issue.
These are a few things that the participants mentioned, that the support program was a space to talk and listen and challenge. It's like you are going to another planet. It's like a window to help me find people and talk.
And indeed, it seemed that it was a very special place, really with a certain boundary where they could try to challenge certain ideas, or this was a place where I could really talk about the conflicts that we have within the community. But important, therefore, is to it's anonymous. So in a sense, we noticed that it was not that much about building a social network or rebuilding social networks outside this program, but it really much stayed within the program as a space where they could discuss certain things and hold certain ambivalent topics which are at stake outside the group. Because indeed, this was not without any risks of reiterating difficult situations. There were tensions. So also for some participants, it could also be quite painful to reiterate certain conflicts or topics or differences that are at stake within the community. So in a sense, many of them participants said that it was important that it also closed, and the relationship that existed became therapy buddies, but not real buddies. As one of these quotes symbolizes. Maybe Lise, you can read that.
Yeah, one of the participants said, maybe I didn't want these people to become real and we start to see each other flawed. I will always remember the end of the support group. I found some other Iranian people. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sofie and Lise. And also, again, thanks for being so good with timing. You makes my job very easy today. So next presenter is Nouran El-Hawary. And she's a PhD candidate from the University of Otago, working with mental health and well-being provision for former refugees as a main component within the integration strategy held by the government of New Zealand. Welcome, Nouran.
I think it was his turn.
Oh, sorry, that was my mistake. Should we switch?
Okay.
We can switch. That's okay. Just keep the slides. My mistake. It's because you were opposite my. Oh, okay, we go. Sorry about that. You were opposite my.
Okay. So good afternoon. Yeah, my name is Nouran. I'm a PhD candidate, and in the University of Otago in Otago, New Zealand. I have started my research last year in March 2023, and my fieldwork has been initiated in January of this year. But my original research wasn't about trauma, but it was about well-being and how we can find out the ways through which refugees can live and continue their lives according to the ways that they see important and matters more, despite the inherent paradoxes of humanitarian logic and conduct. But as a non-Western researcher, well-being didn't come very naturally to me or innate innate. But it was a very product of what I call the intellectual itinerary of how this research came about. And I classified into 3 phases of trigger, experimentation, and reconceptualization. So the trigger started in Cairo when I used to work as advocacy and communication officer in one of the international NGOs that was aiming to integrate mental health and psychosocial support services for mainly refugees and also including migrants and host communities, meaning Egyptians. But this project was not designed in response of a permanent need among refugees, but mostly a manifestation of a shift within the global health policies to mainstream refugees in national health system. So believing this cost effective, since 85% of refugees worldwide are locked in Global South in the first country of refuge, transit countries like Egypt. So I was luckily enough to escape this work and have another master's degree in human rights and democratization, so I can critically and academically reflect on this experience, despite it was very political science focused. I had an ethnographic element into it to see this kind of global health refracted into the experiences and everyday lives. But this time I did it in Rabat, Morocco, among refugees and migrants from West Africa. Then when it came time I wanted to do a PhD, I know that I wanted to do it in medical anthropology, but I was disoriented, I was more stuck in conceptualizing my proposed topic. So I said, okay, I will be more specific. So instead of examining refugees' access to health, I would do it on mental health. So in corresponding with potential PhD supervisors, one of them, she told me to replace mental health with well-being. But well-being itself is a contested term, very Eurocentric. Also, it has been an interest of positivist disciplines like positive psychology, public health, and economics. But lately, it has been commercialized, to promote this kind of personal responsibilization over one's well-being. So it assures that he's relentlessly productive in a neoliberal economy. So I digged into the literature, but I observed that well-being is very ubiquitous within New Zealand culture, politics, and public. So New Zealand launched its first well-being budget in 2019. And this is after joining the WEGO, the Wellbeing Economy Government Group, in 2018 alongside Scotland and Iceland. And it's a way to shift the focus from the GDP and more centered around the general well-being in order to formulate economic policies. But as far as refugees are concerned, the refugee resettlement strategy that was endorsed by the government of New Zealand in 2012 includes well-being among its 5 major outcomes: health and well-being. So health is assessed by the visits of the GP, but well-being is assessed in terms of accessing mental health services only. But even before we can find well-being inserted in the social policies of New Zealand, and this is due to the recognition of the rights of the indigenous population of New Zealand, the Maori people. So we have the Maori model of well-being, Te Whai Tapawha, that was developed by the half Maori psychiatrist, Mason Doré. And here he was more like diverting from psychoanalytic framework more into cultural psychiatry to be more aware of the structural consequences through which Maori people are living. So the model is including spiritual, emotional, physical, and family dimensions, and lately they added the element of the land. So the initial argument that my research advances that assessing refugees' well-being in terms of mental health services alone discloses the common sense morality that assumes refugees are necessarily traumatized, which reinforces their exceptionality and then embeds their otherness, which may hinder their meaningful integration in the society as primarily aimed by the resettlement strategy. So here I want to advance well-being as a discursive space to highlight this kind of conflict of priorities, but also the humanitarian assumptions of what it means for a refugee to be well. So well-being, in the sense of my research, I use it to break from the predominant frameworks of trauma and resilience that only view refugees as an object of pity, passiveness, and neediness, which dehumanize them and also prevent us from seeing any kind of normalcy. So I follow the critical refugee studies approach, in which I see well-being as a new analytic, in which to try make us appreciate and also recognize the refugee epistemologies, creativity, and life-sustaining practices that insist on a better life, not only based on fear, but based on humanity, dignity, and futurity. So here I proclaim well-being from anthropological framework lens, that well-being as a basic human condition that helps us to have this kind of thoughtful, creative, and aspirational ordering of past, present, and future, and also to way to rehumanize refugees. So my fieldwork site is in the city of Dunedin. So the city of Dunedin has a very peculiar, interesting history. It is located in the South Island of New Zealand, and it also associated with a very glorious past, but not anymore. So Dunedin is going through or enduring this shift of power and centrality from the South Island to the north, so to the economic capital of Auckland, and that has 1.5 million, and also the metropolis capital of the main political capital of Wellington. So Dunedin has been announced in 2015 as a new location for resettlement, and this amid the rise of the so-called refugee crisis that after the eruption of the Syrian revolution, Syrian civil war. So since then, in 2016, Dunedin started to receive predominantly Arab refugees from Syria, then Iraqis, few Yemenis, few Palestinians, but also Afghan, because in New Zealand government they see us not as Arabs but Middle Eastern, like this like large identifying umbrella of Middle Easterns. New Zealand started, I said, the 1960s to experience critical depopulation. So now the size of the overall population is 126,000 people. The main activities is surrounded around the tertiary institution. It has like the largest and oldest university in New Zealand, University of Otago, and the hospital as well. So my research tries to have an answer to the overarching question of how, in this context, refugees, Arab refugees in Dunedin perceive, experience, and understand well-being. And I try to find answer to the question through other sub-questions of, firstly, do the official mental health services designed for them help them to obtain this sense of well-being? Second is, and since we don't have any kind of intelligible equivalent of well-being in Arabic, either formal or vernacular, so how refugees understand, practice, express well-being in terms of good life in their everyday practices, imagination, and mode of narrative. And then I try also to situate all this kind of ideals, imagination, narratives within the context of the city. So the city for me is not only a geographical container, but also I want to see how these urban dynamics interplay with those people who have been resettled lately. In terms of methodology, and since I'm trying to challenge and contend with policies and strategies, I'm interested in the views, perspectives, and experiences not only of refugees, but also service providers, policymakers, and I do content analysis to the body of the strategy and policies itself, news archive, but I also try to narrow like the cultural identification into Arab as like more specific, but also more like, evolving identification than Middle Eastern that I feel very vague and more of a geopolitical and colonial construct. I said also I try to include these kind of urban dynamics, this kind of, experience of this empowerment that the city of Dunedin has been experiencing even before the arrival of refugees. And surprisingly, that the city of Dunedin experienced the migration and diaspora group of Lebanese who migrated since 1890. So no one is really aware of this factor, but also contrasting how it was for those people and how also they had similar experiences of not the violence, but difficulties of settling down. But I also include my experience in autoethnography, but I reflect on my identity as an Arab, as a non-Western, grappling with this notion of well-being that is everywhere in New Zealand. So my findings so far that yes, New Zealand has this kind of positive framing of refugees' mental health in terms of well-being, but still the very much resettlement practices still dwell on psychopathological representation that is very preoccupied with trauma and PTSD. And you can find it even repeated by resettlement practitioners, but also in policies that I call that the trauma products line. So you have trauma-informed interpretation services. You have trauma-informed training for educators. So here, this kind of like bureaucratization of trauma outside the domain of mental health, but also how it is cross-cuts other service provision domains is very interesting. But at the same time, you have the processes of the unintended uses of mental health services by refugees. So how, like 90%, I mean, according to the interviews with some, that 90% of refugees who access mental health services, they use it as a mean to another end. So for example, 30% of houses in Dunedin are classified as substandard, and these community houses is the one that they give it to refugees. So for them to complain about the housing quality, you know, as a refugee, you have only to be grateful. So you cannot, you know, object the quality of housing. So if they go and they say, okay, it caused like trauma or mental distress, here they would be more heard. But you have this kind of trauma became like more of like a culture trait of a refugee. So a refugee must be traumatized, but this kind of popular understanding of war trauma only associated with the moment of crisis, this kind of popular plot of only crisis moment. But you don't know that trauma is ongoing. Maybe I say trauma is ongoing, but I mean the loss and disposition is ongoing. So those refugees who come like for as a doctors or like professions, years of expertise, and have their credentials not accepted, and they are like you know, give it up, and either they have like to study from the beginning, like 7 years of tertiary education, or they give it up and they become like Uber drivers. And how devastating is that? So the popular understanding of trauma as a way of like recognizing suffering of the other doesn't count to all these kind of things that I call it trauma upon trauma until I find another term. So I think that's all for me. Thanks a lot for your listening.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation, relating a lot to my own work on post-migratory stresses, so we have to talk more after the presentations. And I apologize for the confusion before, mixing up the order. So now, last but not least, Osinachi Ezema, and I'm apologizing for my pronunciation of your name. You hold honors in theater and film studies from the University of Nigeria, and is a doctoral candidate of Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the Institute of African Studies in the University of Ibadan. Welcome.
Yeah. It's my first time in Denmark, let me announce. And it's such a beautiful city. A beautiful place, really. It's a place I would like to come over and over again. Yeah, so I'm not, I seem one of the few persons here who doesn't have a background in psychology or medicals and all of that. So I've been wondering since, how am I going to fit in? I have a background in performance studies. I read theater arts in my undergraduates, and then I concentrated on playwriting. And one thing that creativity does is, especially for writers, it gives you this sense each time you want to look at things, at drawing patterns, right? You try to connect dots. So for today, I'm going to look at conceptual issues in migration. And then I'm a doctoral candidate in Diaspora and Transnational Studies. So the question I've been asking myself is, how will my background in film and theater arts inform what is going on or contribute to the discussion of medical humanities? And how will what I'm doing in diaspora studies, how will it also contribute to the question of medical humanities? And then I have to also observe that the last discussion yesterday, the panel on who cares about medical humanities, that was so interesting. In fact, after that discussion, I have added more questions to the questions which you find in the slide, to the questions I wanted to start the presentation with. So I would do the first part of the what I thought about the presentation yesterday, and then the second part of my presentation. So my topic, framing mental crisis and the consequences of Limbus diaspora in Shine Your Eyes. Shine Your Eyes is a film, right? Okay, so I would like to capitalize on the first part of my topic to give some 2-minute engagement with the conversations of yesterday. Maybe that way, I would better be able to situate the rest of my presentation within the context of the larger demands and urgency of the field of medical humanities. Now, I started with some questions. Yeah. Okay. Now, I checked the website of cultmind, and these are their broad questions. Can the emotional worlds of diverse groups of people be translated? And then I asked, into what? Right? So the second question, okay, yeah. Now, are the core characteristics of the human mind universal across cultures, ethnic groups, and civilizations? To which I ask, is the human mind universal, or is it dependent on the cultures into which it is born? And if so, are cultures, ethnicities, and civilization universal? Now, can the side disciplines be global? So, and then I ask, are the side disciplines causal disciplines or consequential disciplines? In other words, do the side disciplines study human mind as it is affected and determined by their environment and cultures, which is consequential, or do they study cultures and the environment as they are affected or determined by the human mind, which is causal? So, in that sense, what I'm trying to refer to is we seem to, in migration and diaspora studies, we read the issues of mental health in diaspora studies in the context of victimhood and trauma. And then I find a problem. The problem is in the way we look at victimhood, and then, of course, diaspora and migration studies are divided into two, right? Especially the migrants. We have the voluntary migrants and we have the involuntary migrants or diaspora. Now, the voluntary migrants are assumed to be people who decide on their own to go and who are not forcefully displaced, right? And then the involuntary diasporas are the forcefully displaced ones. And then the argument is that because the involuntary diaspora are forcefully displaced, they should be tagged the victim diaspora. Now, and then that leads to an argument or a debate between what Robin Cohen has called the purist diaspora scholars and then what I have called the radical diaspora scholars. The purist diaspora scholars maintain that we should assign victimhood, at least more of it, to the involuntary diaspora as against the voluntary diaspora. Now, the radical diaspora scholars insist that we should look at victimhood, that in fact every member of the diaspora or migrant bears or has a share in victimhood, right? So, and then, yeah, that's the argument. Now, this is the problem as the purist diaspora scholars see it. They say that the attempt to not only recognize but almost equalize the victimhood of the two categories of diaspora runs the risk of undermining the essential and distinctive victimhood of involuntary diaspora, whom, in emphasis of their distinctive victimhood, have been termed victim diaspora. Now, the radical diaspora scholars say that the non-recognition and emphasis on the victimhood of the involuntary diaspora will undermine attention on the trauma inherent in the dispersal caused by economies of displacement and other mental imbalance suffered in being detached from the familiar environment. The familiar environment. Now, this is the problem as I see it. The problem with the attempt to almost equalize the victimhood of the two diaspora is not, as the PDS fear, that it would undermine the distinctive victimhood of the involuntary diaspora, but One, it runs the risk of emasculating and homogenizing the distinctive peculiarities of the victimhood of the voluntary diaspora, which the RDS tries so hard to prove. Two, the successful homogenizing of the victimhood of both diasporas runs the risk of limiting critical research into the pluriversality of the multiple strands of diasporic victimhood in general, but more particularly the voluntary diaspora. But here again is even the problem. It's even more worrisome the fact that in the attempt to emphasize the victimhood of the voluntary diaspora, the radical diaspora scholars tend to focus more on the question of why instead of the how of victimhood, right? And then here's the broad question, which I was discussing with Dr. Peter yesterday. The broad question is, how do we recognize and emphasize the victimhood of the voluntary diaspora without homogenizing their victimhood with that of the involuntary diaspora, but rather focus on the how question to the extent of implicating the unseen pluriversality of strands of victimhood in voluntary diaspora. Now, this is my proposal, that through a thorough conceptualization of the how, not just the why, of the victimhood of the voluntary diaspora, it may be discovered in the comparative analysis of the root, the route, which is the complication and the escalation, the reconciliation, which is the discovery, the recreation and return processes of the two diasporas, that the voluntary diaspora may hold more hidden shades than seen yet in the diasporic victimhood. Now, my task today is, one, to condense existing literature on diasporic victimhood into an evolution of what I call the diasporologic cycle. Now, if you look at the way water flow changes state, from liquid to gas to, it can go to solid even, then there's a way it returns. So it's a cycle, right? So I want to look at how do we read victimhood beyond the root, so that the argument shifts from who has more shares to victimhood depending on how they are displaced, whether they are forced or whether they just live by displacement economies. To me, that shouldn't be the argument. The argument should go beyond the root, and that's why I've added other stages. Beyond the root, we have the route, and the route has to do with the complications, right, or the escalation. We also have the reconciliation. How do we assist people with victimhood? What interventions do we give, right? And then we have the recreation processes. After we have assisted them, to what extent do our assistants or those our assistants help them to recreate themselves and begin to look towards homeland, right? Oh, sorry. So that's the first task, to condense existing literature into what I call the diasporologic cycle for the comparison of diasporic victimhood. The second is to use the diasporologic cycle to conduct a comparative analysis of victimhood of the voluntary and involuntary diaspora that transcends the limiting concentration on the roots of victimhood and the judgment of the diasporic victims. The third is to make a case for what I call the Limbus diaspora, which is the challenged migrant diaspora, the CMD, a distinctive yet homogenized strand of the voluntary diaspora using the theme, Shine Your Eyes. And then the other one is to examine how culture, the Diaspora or Ekurobi culture exemplified among the Igbos of Eastern Nigeria, can implicate strands of diasporic victimhood called the Limbus diaspora. Then the last is to examine the transnational implication of Limbus diaspora within the context of unconsummated nostalgic rupture and nostalgic plague. Sorry? Okay. So task number one, condensing the existing literature on diasporic victimhood. Now, I conceived the diasporic diasporologic cycle from hydrologic cycle, which is the movement of this water through states, right? And then this is my idea of it. This is the diasporologic cycle of the involuntary diaspora. The involuntary diaspora may be displaced by, it could be climate, it could be invasion, it could be war, it could be famine, it could be political persecution. Now, this is the flow. You can say the flow, it's a collective one. The tube is a collective one. And then somebody made a presentation on collective victimhood just before us. So the tube for the involuntary diaspora is a collective one, right? Then they move through sort of a gaseous state. The assistance we offer them, here is the assistance we offer them. This could be the international migration laws, it could be asylum laws, or whatever assistance or intervention we give them that doesn't allow them to go beyond or to go into that red zone or to cross the nostalgic bar, right? So they get settled, but you see that they live as a circle. And then they return, they are trapped down as a half circle, right? Now you see the plane here, the line, the angle here. This angle, somebody was talking about belonging, the belonging and then multicultural, how a society or a state can be, the level of the multiculturality of a state, right? So now this angle defines how multicultural a state is or how tolerant it is. If it is very tolerant, the angle will go down a bit. If it is not, it goes high. And then that determines how they finally begin to flow back at a point to recreate themselves and flow back. And why is it necessary that we are able to read trauma and victimhood in terms of rupture and return? We've been discussing victimhood. We haven't been discussing sort of how do we reconcile or how do we give a solution to it. In diaspora studies, we think of homeland and home and then the host nation. If you leave your place, there's a kind of feeling you have that doesn't really get settled until you return. And that's why the presentation made on the child, you were displaced when you were 4 years, and then you still keep thinking of home. So you get reconciled after 4 years or 7 or thereabout. What is it about homeland? And then can we liken homeland, the return of the migrant or the diaspora, the return back to homeland, can we liken it to the resolution we can give to mental health patients so that at the point of rupture, right, you migrate, and then at the point of reconciliation, the intervention we give to mental health patients, the return, that return, can we look at it as return to homeland, right? So this is it for the involuntary diaspora. Now, okay, that explains now what about the voluntary diaspora, those who migrate on their own? Look at their movement. You see, it's not collective. They live here, they are displaced by displacement economies, right? So their movement is sort of individualized. So they move, they arrive, you see the borders are doubled, right? So that's the border here, double-gated borders. So they arrive half a circle because no matter how you try, it seems we do not feel the same as we do at home in the foreign land, right? So they arrive half circle. But these are fortunate migrant diasporas who are displaced by maybe the economies. So some of them are fortunate, they make money, or they get what they have gone to the foreign land to do, or right? So they are able to remit back. The nostalgia they have, the feeling of incompleteness, being outside, the disturbances, the intolerance, the prejudices, and all what they feel here, it's the host nation. So you can never be like the host nation. Here. Sorry about that. So you can never be like the host nation. So, but at a point, they begin to recreate themselves, and then through what we call transnationalism, right? You begin to reconnect to home. And that process of reconnecting to home informally, right, has a way of helping you to solve or deal with mental or victimhood or trauma, arising from displacement, whether forced or voluntary, right? So these guys, through the tube, they return back. But what is homeland for these fortunate migrant diasporas? Homeland becomes a desired and welcoming site for the sublimatory performance of diasporic death of return and consummatory healing of nostalgic plague. Homeland wants to welcome you, right? Now, what about those who migrate and then are not as fortunate? If we use the word voluntary diaspora to cover for people who are not forcefully displaced, that also covers for the fortunate and the challenged, rather, what I've called the challenged migrant diaspora. So that's the circle. Okay. Making a case for the Limbus diaspora. I was going to get to, okay. Making a case for the Limbus diaspora. What have I called the Limbus diaspora? What about those who are not as fortunate? And then they proceed into the red zone. If you do not achieve what you've gone to a host land to do, what really happens to you? And then the delays you have in returning home, either through a transnational or direct return, what does it really cost you? Does it add to the victimhood you have? Right? So, I want to make a case for what I call the Limbus diaspora. Now, the Limbus diaspora or limboid space is the space across the nostalgic bar. That is the nostalgic bar, in between the white and then the red. A nostalgic bar crossed into when the progression or escalation of the victimhood or mental crisis sustained by the migrant diaspora from the displacement or rupture from homeland becomes continually linear, tearing away from the natal homeland and the nostalgic bar. Okay, now here's the film Shine Your Eyes that I want to use and illustrate what happens to those who are not as fortunate, to make it, who are challenged. Now, to consider what can lead to escalations or progression beyond the nostalgic plague into the limboid space, I turn to the film Shine Your Eyes. This is Nsukka in Nigeria, 1988. This is São Paulo in Brazil, 2009. These are two brothers from the same parents. Their father is dead. That's the firstborn in front. That's the second. Now, Ikena, the firstborn is Ikena. The firstborn, the name is Ikena. The second is Amadi. Ikena, in his migration to Brazil, is not as economically fortunate as the other voluntary migrants who go on to maintain a transnational connection with homeland and ultimately go on to consummate a diasporic desire for return. So what happens to him? Now, at a point, Ikena estranges himself from homeland and isolates himself from friends and diasporic members in Brazil. Unable to beat and meet the economic migration goals and homeland expectations, Ikena estranges himself from homeland migrants as well as isolates himself from friends and fellow diasporic members in Brazil. Resigning to this rural part of the town and dwelling in this old and deserted house, Ikena would neither reach nor be reached by the migrants, which is the homeland, for 5 years. Now, determined to find his brother, that's the second born, Amadi, to find his brother, Amadi Ikena's younger brother arrives Brazil, São Paulo, to search him out. He arrives with Ikena's guitar sent to him by his mother. He searches through all the places where Ikena had claimed he lived and worked without success. Now, Ikena is finally found at last within an insular space, trying to build a grand hologram to break Chukwu's or God's secrets and mysteries. His brother Amadi watches him demonstrate and boast of his ambitions in disappointment, conclusive of an insane man. Okay, what do we observe from Ikena's migration? Ikena in his migration to Brazil is of course not as economically fortunate. Now, unable to beat, he estranges himself. Now, how do we frame this exception that we do not yet have in migration or diaspora studies? Since we've been concentrating our attention of victimhood on the root, what displaces people, instead of the progression, right? So what I've tried to use this film to plot an exceptional kind of voluntary diaspora. And then you see the migrant. The migrant, I use the word to define the homeland, right? So he leaves from the migrant, gets to that point, he's unable to fit in. So, but because the pressure on homeland is high on him, the pressure of homeland is high on him, and then he's not able to, of course, remit back, right? So what does he do? he estranges himself. He runs into a kind of insular space where he cuts off from homeland and then cuts off from everybody. He enters that red zone. That red zone is what I've called the Limbus diaspora. It's a liminal space, right? Now, that liminal space also helps us to imagine. I may need to rush now. Okay, yeah, generating is diasporic victimhood. Oh my God. Okay. Okay. Task number 3, the occasion for crossing the nostalgic bar. What can actually lead to crossing the nostalgic bar? I've argued that culture, I've argued that culture can lead one, or a diaspora, or a migrant, to cross into the nostalgic bar, or the red zone. There is a culture among the Igbos, the Diaspora, who is the firstborn. The firstborn who inherits the power of the family, right, also inherits the task and burden and expectation and pressure of homeland, right? So, that culture pushes them. Usually, they do not go to school. The firstborn usually do not go to school because they have to go and make things and then take care of others, right? But the pressure is always so high on them that when they migrate and they are not able to meet up with homeland expectations, they cut off from homeland entirely. And then that process of cutting off from homeland helps to, or rather precipitates or increases their mental or trauma or victimhood, while also increasing the victimhood of homeland. What a professor in the Institute of African Studies, Diaspora and Transnational Studies, has called extalgia. That victimhood should not only be read in terms of nostalgia for the migrant or diaspora, that also those who are left behind suffer grief and then pains. That's maybe the last now. The burden of the opera, okay, which I've explained. That's up, right? That's up, right? The time is up. I would like to say, okay, all right. Well, maybe during the question and answer period. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes now for a discussion. So would you, all the panelists, please come up here? So. Yes, we'll start over here.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Osinachi, I hope I pronounced it correctly. Yeah. Thank you. It was a wonderful presentation. I really liked it because it was so fresh, and both being a migrant and working with refugees, I thought it was quite inspiring in some aspects. I wanted to ask you one concrete question. How would you define a involuntary migrant, or what was the word you used? Because in my head there's always like a bit ambiguity in that term, voluntary, involuntary. Sometimes people leave voluntarily, like they get on a bus or a plane, but the reason for leaving is usually something which is not according to their own will. So I was wondering, do you mean like refugees, people who are forcibly displaced, or is it a more broader term? Maybe I missed something there. Thank you.
What I think, it's also a confusing term. In diaspora studies, we look at even those who are called the voluntary diaspora. Do people really leave their homeland, except people just want to go on tourism and all of that? But apart from that, do people really leave their homeland for nothing? Right? Something actually displaces somehow, right? So there's a kind of victimhood for if I get your question right, right? So there's a form of victimhood for all forms of, that's the argument anyway, right? For all forms of diaspora, be it voluntary or involuntary. The involuntary diaspora defines those who leave maybe because there's war in the homeland, because of famine, because of some kind of forceful, right? As opposed to those who, I don't personally believe that even those who are called the voluntary diaspora live voluntarily. I don't personally believe that, right? So people are pushed because they desire something. So there's an element of desire in the push, of that people sustain and all of that, if I get your question right, right?
Okay, so we take.
Okay, it's related to voluntary. I'm Brazilian, and it was very nice to see the São Paulo. And I'd like to think about gender, because I'm living here as I'm a psychologist here in Denmark, and I myself have a lot of questions to live, if I should live or not live in Denmark. And then once I was questioned, one friend bring me a question and said, but you have the freedom to go home. But I have children here. So and the law here, if you have your children here, and it's very difficult to, if you divorce, for example, to bring your children to your own country. So, and I have many patients at my office with the same questions, and they live, I think I live in somehow in the Limbus position. And that it's between, because I don't know what's really voluntary or not voluntary diaspora. So, and when include family, gender, and law, I think complicated even more the question. So I'd like that you comment about if you have anything about thinking about, the gender related to this case of Limbus.
I don't really. The Limbus diaspora, the way I've used it is space. It includes everybody. It's not gender sensitive in terms of it's not discriminatory, right? Anybody could enter the Limbus diaspora. The question is, what pushes you into the Limbus diaspora, right? And then, of course, there is the last part of that slide that I didn't show, because the Limbus diaspora also allows us to imagine, what about those who, the diaspora, the migrants, who, I think it's reported now that about 70-something thousand missing migrants, and by missing migrants, I mean people who migrate and then, die in the process. They do not finally return. That's the dark red part at the bottom of that edition. So anybody, what I'm saying is, anybody doesn't mean whether, it doesn't matter whether you are family or you are a man or woman or so. Anybody could go into that limbo. The question is, what pushes you there? That's the question you may need to ask yourself now.
Yeah, I'm relating to the motherhood and how patriarchy creates the responsibility of the mother and the woman in society. So I think it's different. If you leave your child in a country and move to another country, if you're a man, I think the consequences for yourself and mental health will be a little different. It's in this case that I bring the question. I think there is there is something here different. But okay, I agree that there is something, I don't know, universal about, but I don't believe in universally things. I think we have a body, and this body has a color. We have a culture, and we have a gender also. So I think if I was transsexual or if I was a lesbian, I think it's different. I think we have also to address these questions in relation to culture, myself.
All right, I would also like to invite you to, what I've developed is, because I'm a creative writer, right? So when I think of things, I think of them in terms of the conceptual or the patterns, right? So what I've done is a model sort of for reading the migrant or the diaspora. Now, you are invited to bring your case into it, see how it fits in. At what point do you contradict this model, or do you align with it, right? So you can come in from the agenda perspective and say, oh no, I think this model doesn't really fit in because my case is an exception. For instance, even within the involuntary, the diagram I've given for the involuntary diaspora, I believe that the archetypal African migrant or diaspora with the African American is an exception to that model, right? So there are exceptions, but what matters is, in our attempt to curate theories for the medical humanities, we should have models on which we build our understanding of the field, and all of that. So I invite you to also intervene and then see how we better the model.
Sorry, I don't want to break an interesting discussion, but we have so many hands and so little time. Can we pass it on to maybe Anna, please? Oh, sorry, I didn't.
Hi, I have a question to the first speaker, to Charisse, if I'm not mispronouncing your name. I remember at some point you mentioned all these different types of activities or spheres that could help Syrian refugees, right, to connect with broader society. And you mentioned things like sports or entertainment and a few others. I didn't see religion, spirituality type of activities there, and I wonder if that was an intentional choice to omit them, because I imagine for many people these are important grounds for creating bonds and connecting.
Oh, sorry. I think maybe I just didn't say it. So it was definitely included, religious activities, as one of the 5 activities we looked at. And it's also included in the 3rd dimension of that model, of the conceptual model. So it's definitely there because it is, as you mentioned, crucial. Yeah.
So we are running a bit short of time, but we have time for 2 more brief questions. Maybe you and then Anna at the end.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a quick question to Belgian team. Could you tell me, it was any supervision from your university, if there are, I don't know, some kind of ethic commission who are asking you to prove what kind of methods are you going to use at the university, because as I understood, it was under the umbrella of the university. It's my first question about the infrastructure of the project, because we were struggling with the same situation at Polish university with Ukrainian groups which were trying to support, to help. And we had to go to the commission, ethical commission. And the second question is, if you have any ethical situation, you as a providers of help, for instance, that you were asked to do more than you expect, that you think that you are going to do, means financial support, logistic support, health supports, giving your phone number, receiving calls in the evening. Also, it was an ethical matter how far we can go as a university with humanitarian help at the university. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Relating to your first question, our program was funded by the Emergency Fund of KU Leuven. It's a solidarity fund. So the people from this fund asked our team to develop a program. We were very free in developing this program based on our own expertise. So there was no interference from the university relating to the content and how we developed the program. We updated them on the things that we were about to do, but they didn't interfere. Regarding the research part, of course, we asked for ethical approval to do this research. So we have to follow certain guidelines regarding consent and privacy rules. But regarding the content of what we were doing in the program, there were no specific guidelines or rules. I don't know, Sofie, whether you want to add something or...
No, I think one particular deontological or ethical issue is also concerning to boundaries. Your second question is, of course, the program was conducted for our own peers, our own colleagues, doctoral students. We are also doctoral students, postdoctoral students at the university. So this was also one of the questions at the ethical board, one of the concerns, if we might know them or we would have personal information that would also interfere with their profession at the university. So this was something that we, of course, took into consideration or discussed. And with every participant, we have a first intake session to discuss certain worries or if there are some kind of interferences in the program as such. So this is something we took into account. At the same time, we are also there as clinicians, as therapists within a particular framework of as a psychologist, which is bounded to professional secrecy, etc. So this also gives a framework which is explained in the first session and the intake session of what our role is and what it is not. But of course, and I think this is something we stressed, as it is part of an institution, the institution itself, the university has also other connotation, or is also connotations within diaspora community. So in that sense, there were some interferences of what the university can do or what the university is and what are we as a clinical team. But this is something we try to really express and to clarify within the first session, individual session.
Yeah, and maybe to add one more thing, we are a mental health team, but our university also has a social team to help people finding housing, study loans. So these more practical social issues were dealt by other services at our university. So in that sense, we were in a more or less comfortable situation that we could afford this psychosocial support and that we knew that other things were also taken care of by other services at our university.
Anna, last question?
Yeah, very quickly. Thank you so much. I just had this question, trying to bring these different papers, make papers talk to each other as well. So for the first two papers, I was just thinking how it's really interesting how they, in Charisse, you talked about this sort of these bonding social networks that are within the co-ethnics or co-nationals, right? And then in the second paper, there are all these intervention groups are based within the same culture, for people with the same culture. And I was just, and we of course heard a lot about the healing properties of cultural traditions and cultural recognition these 2 days, but I was just wondering if there is a danger there also of sort of romanticizing or essentializing this kind of cultural, the importance of within the same culture, the healing properties of within the same culture, right? Especially for people who come from very divided societies. And I think both Nouran's and Osinachi's papers kind of challenge that a little bit. And I think Osinachi's quite explicitly, and then Nouran talked about these kind of identities that are imposed on the settlements. And I think there's a lot of history in transcultural psychiatry of kind of romanticizing these groups, families, and these kind of extended kin, ethnic group. So I was just wondering if you could reflect on that briefly. Thank you.
Anyone?
Yeah?
I think, just off the top of my head, I think that's a really important reflection. And I was thinking the same thing before I gave the presentation, was what's the larger context of this and what are the implications of it also. And there is other research also in Sweden that has looked at specific co-ethnic networks and found that actually in some of them being confined mostly to bonding networks is actually detrimental to mental well-being. So it's kind of, it's very complex. So it's not something to take as like an isolated finding, but to take in a larger context.
Last comment?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think there is so much essentialization going on, especially in context of New Zealand as a colonial settler society, and how you find these kind of ethnicities and division, essentializing groups, but also it silenced the ongoing, conflicts within the, these kind of labeled communities. But also I find there's so much going on to have what they call former refugees, in a way to have them feel more belonging to New Zealand, but also it doesn't matter how many years you stay in New Zealand, you're still a former refugee or a refugee, for short. And it's very striking because there was an incident in, about a parliament member. She was resettled in New Zealand in 1997 as Iraqi Kurdish refugee, and then she was accused of shoplifting. But the way that she was addressed in the news as a former refugee, and they didn't, like you mentioned, that she was a politician, a lawyer, graduated from Oxford. She was reduced to this. So it doesn't matter how many generations, yeah.
Well, this should come
I think I'll have to break the discussion, else people will have no coffee, but feel free to keep discussing in the coffee break. Thank you very much.